The mare came down on the ice, and Nora Kessler went over its shoulder into a drift that took the wind clean out of her. Snow drove sideways across the whole white world, and somewhere above the ringing in her skull, she heard the animals scream and bolt for home without her. Blood was already warming the collar of her coat, bright against the frozen ground where her temple had struck a buried stone. She tried to rise, and the pain folded her back down into the cold. 200 yards off, through a curtain of blizzard, a lantern swung on the porch of a house she had spent 2 winters teaching herself not to look at. It was marshland. Of all the fence lines in Sweetwater to bleed on, she had chosen the one man's ground she could never repay, and the knowing of it hurt worse than her head. The lamp came down off its hook and started toward her through the storm. Gideon Marsh saw the dark shape against the snow before he understood it was a person. He came off the porch with his rifle first and his mercy second, because that was the order the last few years had taught him. Then the wind pulled the shape's hood back, and he stopped dead in the drift, with the cold sliding down his spine. He knew that face. He had begged that face for shelter once, on a night exactly like this one, with his own blood freezing to his saddle, and that face had shut a bolted door between them and let him ride on to die. For a long moment he simply stood there, while the storm screamed between them, and every hard thing in him voted to turn around. She had left him for dead. The scar along his ribs still ached when the weather changed, a cold clock counting off the debt she owed. Now the ledger had flipped clean over, and the woman who once closed the door lay helpless in his snow, and only he could choose whether she lived to see morning. Nora's eyes found him through the blood and the white, and she knew him too. Recognition moved across her ruined face, and with it came something worse than fear, which was shame, because she understood exactly what she was asking, and exactly what she had once refused. Her lips shaped a word the wind tore away. It might have been stay, or please, or maybe his own name. What he would do about it was the only question left in the world. 2 winters back, Nora Kessler had been a widow of 11 days when the knock came. Her husband Tom lay under a mound of frozen earth she could see from the kitchen window, put there by the same fever that had nearly taken her down with him. Grief had hollowed her out until she was more echo than woman, and terror had moved into the empty place, whispering that everything past her own threshold meant to kill her. So when a man's fist pounded the door that night, and a stranger's voice begged through the wood for a fire and a corner to bleed in, she stood frozen in the dark with her back against the boards and did nothing. She let the voice grow weaker. She let it ride away. The next morning, she found the blood on her steps, gone black in the cold, and something in her broke that never set right again. She told herself she was a coward. She told herself she had failed the one test a decent person is given, that when it counted, she had chosen a bolt over a life. That belief followed her through 2 years like a shadow sewn to her heel. Every kindness she did afterward felt like a coin dropped into a debt too deep to fill, and she did many kindnesses, and none of them ever touched the bottom of it. Gideon Marsh had ridden away from that door with a bullet graze weeping through his coat and a lesson setting hard as the ice on his lashes. He had been running rustlers off his south range and taken lead for his trouble, and he had believed, right up until that bolted door, that a hurt man in this country could still count on a lit window. He did not die. He crawled into his own barn near dawn, with his fingers frozen to the reins, and he lived. And somewhere in that long crawl, he decided he would never again lean his weight on another soul. He built his fences higher after that and kept his own counsel. He let the town call him cold and privately agreed with them. What neither of them could see, from opposite sides of the same wound, was how nearly they were made for each other. She believed she was a woman who failed people, and here was a man who had already survived her worst failure and lived to stand in front of her. He believed no one could be trusted to open a door, and here was the very person whose door had closed, carrying 2 years of penance she had never once been able to confess. Her guilt was shaped exactly like his grievance. Each held the other half of the same broken thing, and neither of them knew it yet. Between their two ranches ran a fence, and between their two families ran something older and meaner than the fence. Tom Kessler and old Amos Marsh had gone to their graves quarreling over a strip of creek bottom, 40 acres of good water grass that each had sworn was his. Lawyers had eaten one winter's profit apiece and settled nothing. The wire along that line had been cut and restrung so many times that the posts leaned like drunks, and every Marsh had learned to spit at the name Kessler before he learned his letters. That was the ground, in every sense, on which Nora Kessler now lay bleeding. Gideon Marsh had never in his life been able to leave a dying thing in the snow, and he cursed that fact even as he knelt. His arms went under her before his grudge could talk him out of it. She weighed almost nothing against his chest, all sodden wool and cold, and when her head lolled to his shoulder, he felt the wet warmth of her blood soak through to his skin, and something in him clenched that had nothing to do with anger. The wind shoved him twice on the walk back, trying to take them both down into the white, but he set his boots and carried her up his own steps and through his own door, and he did not once let himself think the word door. He laid her on the bench by the stove and got the lamp close and saw how bad it was. The stone had opened her scalp above the ear, and scalp wounds bled like sin, but the deeper trouble was the cold that had gotten into her while she lay out there. Her lips had gone the grey of old ash. He worked fast the way a man works who has doctored more animals than people, cutting the frozen coat away, packing the wound, banking the fire until it roared. When her shivering finally started up violent and hard, he almost laughed with relief, because shivering meant her body had decided to fight. Somewhere past midnight, her eyes came open, glassy and lost, and found him sitting across the room with his rifle over his knees, like a man guarding a debt. She wet her cracked lips. "It was you," she breathed. Not a question. The recognition raw on her face, and she said that she had turned him away and had thought of it every night since. His jaw worked, and for a while the only answer was the fire. Then he told her, low and even, that they could speak of old winters when she was strong enough to leave, and until then she should sleep, and she wept without sound at the plain mercy of it, and did as she was told. By the second day the blizzard had buried Sweetwater to the windowsills, and no horse alive could have carried her home, even if she had been fit to sit one. They were shut in together, the woman who closed the door and the man it closed on, roofed under the same storm. He fed her broth a spoon at a time and would not meet her eyes. She watched his hands, which were gentle past all reason for a man who owed her nothing, and the watching undid something in her chest she had kept bolted for 2 long years. He gave her his own bed and slept in a chair by the stove, and when the fever climbed in her again on the second night, he sat awake through all of it with a cloth and a basin, cooling her forehead, the way no one had done for him the winter he nearly died. She surfaced once and caught his face in the low red light, drawn and tired and stubbornly kind, and she tried to tell him he should hate her and could not make the words come. "Rest," was all he said, pressing the cool cloth to her temple. "We are neither of us dying tonight." The blizzard howled against the shutters like a thing denied, and inside the small, warm room, a wall 2 years old began, very quietly, to come apart. On the third morning, a rider fought through the drifts to Gideon's gate, and the sight of him turned Nora cold in a new way. Cyrus Hollis sat his big black horse in the yard with a smile stitched flat across his face, calling up that he had heard the Kessler widow's mare had come home empty. He owned half the snowed-out deeds in the county now, bought for pennies off widows the winter had beaten, and everyone knew he had been circling Nora's water rights for a year. Gideon told him through the door that no Kessler woman was any concern of his, which was a strange thing for a Marsh to say, and stranger still, that saying it felt like the truth. The days folded into each other, the way they do when snow owns the world outside. Nora Kessler grew stronger by slow degrees, and with strength came the terrible awkwardness of being tended by a man she had wronged. She learned the rhythms of his house, the way he rose before light, to break ice on the stock tank, the way he favored his right side, where an old scar pulled in the cold. She asked about it once, softly, and watched him go still at the stove. "That was your winter," he said at last. "Not cruel, just true." And the kitchen held its breath until she made herself answer that she had always known, and that no wound of his had ever healed clean in her either. They spoke of the feud because it was safer than speaking of the door. She told him her side of the creek quarrel, how Tom had ranted about the 40 acres until the fever took him, how she had inherited a war she never wanted, and a strip of grass she had never even walked. He told her how Amos Marsh had done the same to him, handed down a grudge like a family Bible, chapter and verse of who had wronged whom. Sitting across the lamp from each other, wrapped in the hush of the storm, both of them began to suspect that the fence had been built by dead men for reasons that no longer bound the living. Hollis came again when the wind dropped, and this time he did not smile. He stamped snow from his boots on the porch he had not been invited onto and laid a paper on the rail, a lien against the Kessler place for back taxes Nora had not known were owed. "Pay it by the Thaw, or the deed comes to me," he said, and his eyes moved over her in a way that made Gideon step between them without seeming to decide to. "You are healing on Marsh charity," Hollis added, soft as a snake in straw, and warned that folks would talk about a woman alone with a man who was not her husband, and that she had best sell to him and save what was left of her name. When the door shut behind him, the silence was a different weight than before. Nora stood shaking by the window, and it was not the cold. "He is right that they will talk," she said, and told him she had dragged her ruin under his roof, on top of everything else she owed him. Gideon crossed the room slower than he meant to. "He owes you nothing, and you do not owe this town its good opinion," he told her, and when she turned her wet face up to his, the space between them had gone thin as spring ice. Neither of them crossed it, but both felt it, and both knew the other felt it too. That night, she lay in his narrow spare bed listening to him bank the fire in the next room, and for the first time in 2 years, the dark did not feel like a thing waiting to punish her. She thought of how his hands had steadied her, how he had put himself between her and Hollis without a word, how a man she had left to die had done nothing but keep her alive. The arithmetic of it made no sense to her guilt. Somewhere near dawn, she understood she was going to have to tell him the whole truth of that night, the real truth she had never said aloud, and the understanding frightened her worse than the blizzard ever had. The chance came 2 days later, when the snow eased, and Gideon brought a cut of firewood in and found her already waiting by the stove with her hands knotted in her lap. She had rehearsed it 100 ways, and none of them were enough. "When you knocked," she began, and her voice broke and steadied. Tom had been 11 days in the ground, and she had buried him with her own hands because the ground crew could not get through the drifts. She told him she had been half out of her mind with the same fever that killed her husband. "When your fist hit that door, I did not hear a man who needed help," she said. "I heard death come back for me." Gideon set the wood down very carefully, as though a sudden motion might break the thing she was building between them. For 2 years, he had carried a picture of a cruel woman who had listened to him beg and chosen her own comfort over his life. The woman in front of him was not that woman. She was someone drowning in fresh grief, alone in the dark with a new grave outside her window, and the truth of it went through his old grievance like a thaw through river ice. He had wanted an enemy to explain his scar, and instead he had a person as broken as he was, and had been the whole time. "I told myself you were heartless," he said finally, because heartless was easier to hate than frightened. His voice had gone rough as gravel. He said he had spent 2 years angry at a ghost, and then he looked down at his own hands, the hands that had carried her out of the snow, and something in his face gave way. "You did not fail me, Nora. You survived a night that would have broken anybody, and so did I, and we have both been paying for it alone long enough." She was weeping openly now, and when he crossed to her this time, he did not stop at the thin ice between them. He knelt and took her ruined hands in his, and simply held them. The door she had bolted 2 winters ago swung open at last, and no storm came through. Only him. They did not have long to hold the peace they had made. That same afternoon, a neighbor's boy floundered up on a borrowed mule with word that Cyrus Hollis had ridden into town, claiming the Kessler place already, telling the bank that the widow had abandoned it and gone to ground with the Marsh outfit for shelter and worse. He meant to take the deed on abandonment before the Thaw ever came, and he meant to do it by ruining her name so thoroughly that no judge would hear her side. Nora went white. "Everything I have," she whispered. "My water, my grass, Tom's grave, all of it inside that one man's fist." Gideon Marsh stood up from the fire, and the coldness the town had always feared in him settled over his face, but it was pointed now, aimed like a rifle. "Then we do not let him have it," he said. He told her to get her strength up, that when the road opened they would ride to town together and tell the truth with both their names behind it, a Marsh and a Kessler, standing on the same side of the fence for the first time in the history of the valley. That ought to give the county something to chew on besides your ruin. For the first time in 2 years, Nora Kessler laughed, and the sound of it in that snowbound house was like water finding a crack in the ice. The thaw was still days off, and the waiting drew them closer than any calm ever could have. They worked side by side now, Nora strong enough to help him fork hay to the shivering cattle, the two of them leaning into the same wind. In the evenings, she read to him from the only 3 books the house owned while he mended tack by the fire, and more than once, she looked up to find him watching her instead of the leather in his hands. He never looked away when she caught him. That was the thing that undid her most, that a man so long walled up had decided to stop hiding what her presence had come to mean. He told her about it one night without quite meaning to. "Since that winter I have not let a single soul close enough to cost me anything," he said, turning a bridle over and over in his scarred hands. He said he had built the walls so high he forgot there was a man still living behind them. Then a woman he had every right to hate came bleeding into his snow, he told her, and he had spent 3 weeks watching himself hope again and no longer wanted to stop. He set the bridle down. "Nora," he said, and the name was a whole sentence. She crossed the room and put her hand against his jaw, and he closed his eyes and leaned into it like a man coming in out of the cold at last. 2 people who had each sworn never to need anyone stood in a snowbound kitchen and quietly gave up the fight. Hollis did not wait for the thaw. He came in the black hours before dawn with 2 hired men and a lit torch, meaning to burn the Kessler barn and call it the carelessness of an abandoned place, one more nail in the widow's ruin. But Gideon had known men like Hollis all his life and had not slept easy since the boy's warning. The 3 riders found him waiting in the Kessler yard with his rifle and his dead father's shotgun, and Nora beside him holding the second gun with hands that did not shake, because she had learned in his house that a person could choose to stand at a threshold instead of hiding behind it. The fight was short and ugly and lit by a dropped torch guttering in the snow. One of the hired men put a bullet through Gideon's coat sleeve and drew blood along the same old scar, and Nora saw it and did not freeze. She stepped past him into the open and leveled the shotgun at Hollis himself and told him, in a voice the whole cold valley could hear, that she was not abandoned, that she was not alone, and that the next man to raise a torch on her ground would ride home across his own saddle. Hollis looked at the woman he had counted on to be broken and at the Marsh guns beside her, and he understood that his easy arithmetic had failed. The hired men had no stomach for dying over another man's greed, and they melted back into the dark. Hollis backed his black horse to the gate with hatred cold on his face, promising the law would hear of this, promising he was not finished. But the promise had no teeth left in it, because the thing he had come to steal, a frightened widow with no one at her back, did not exist anymore. She stood in her own yard with a Marsh at her side and a gun in her steady hands, and the woman who had once bolted a door had become a woman who guarded one. When the riders were gone, she turned to Gideon, saw the blood on his sleeve, and this time she did not turn away. She tore her own hem to bind it. They rode to town together the moment the road allowed, a Marsh and a Kessler on the same wagon seat, and Sweetwater came out into the cold to stare, At the bank, Gideon Marsh laid down the truth, and his own money both, paying Nora's back taxes in full before Hollis could move, and then he did the thing that ended the feud and the schemer in a single stroke. He announced before the banker and the gathered town that the Marsh and Kessler ranches were to be joined. The disputed creek bottom and the water and the grass folded into one outfit under both their names, so that no lien and no lie could ever prise the two apart again. Cyrus Hollis, when word reached him, found the ground cut clean out from under his boots. A snowed-out widow alone had been prey, a widow standing on 40 acres of good water, with the whole marsh spread behind her, and the town's sympathy turned against the man who had tried to burn her barn was another thing entirely. His creditors, who had smiled at him all winter, suddenly remembered other appointments. Within the month he sold out cheap and left the valley for country where his reputation had not yet arrived, and Sweetwater spat his name the way it had once taught its children to spit the name Kessler. Word of the joining ran through Sweetwater, faster than the Thaw water down the coulées, and the valley took sides the way valleys do. The old men who had kept the feud alive grumbled into their coffee that the dead would be turning in their graves, and Nora heard of it and only smiled, because she had come to believe the dead wanted rest far more than they wanted revenge. The younger families, the ones still trying to hold their own ground against men like Hollis, saw something else in it entirely. They saw two ruined outfits become one strong one, and a widow the winter had not managed to break, and a hard man who had finally chosen to want something again. But the deed and the taxes and the ruin of Hollis were never the heart of it, and both of them knew it. On the first true day of Thaw, when the creek came loud and brown down the disputed bottom, Gideon Marsh walked the old fence line with a pair of wire cutters, and Nora walked beside him. They cut the wire together at every leaning post, the barrier their dead husbands and fathers had bled over, rolling it into useless coils and dropping the posts one by one. 40 acres that two men had gone to their graves fighting for became, in a single afternoon, simply a field where the water ran through nobody's line at all. At the last post he stopped and turned to her with the cutters still in his hand and the mud of spring on both their boots. He was not a man of speeches, and he did not try to be one. "Nora Kessler," he said, "I have hoped exactly once in my life since that winter, and it was the day you opened your eyes in my house and knew me and did not look away. Marry me. Let the fence stay down for good, and let there be one gate on this whole line, and let it be a door that neither of us ever bolts again." Behind them the creek ran through the open ground where the wire had been, saying yes in the only language the country ever fully trusted. She answered him not with the word, but with the act, which was the only proof her guilt had ever been able to accept. She took his scarred hand and led him back up the muddy track to the Kessler house, to the very door she had bolted against him, 2 winters gone, and she opened it wide and stood aside and asked him in. He crossed the threshold she had once closed in his face, and she shut the door behind them both, gently, from the inside, the two of them warm on the same side of it at last. Some debts cannot be paid in coin. This one was paid in reverse, a closed door answered by an open one, and the ledger came out even, and then better than even. They were married in the spring, on the creek bottom itself, standing on the very grass their families had cursed each other over. There was no fence in sight. The town that had once traded the two names like insults came out to watch a Marsh and a Kessler become one name and one outfit, and more than one old rancher wiped his eyes and pretended it was the wind. Nora wore her mother's shawl, and Gideon wore his father's coat, the same coat that had frozen to a saddle 2 winters back, and neither of those dead men's grudges could reach up out of the grave to spoil the day. The ranch they built together prospered, because 2 outfits joined are stronger than 2 outfits at war, and the water that had been worth killing over now watered twice the cattle under one brand. On winter nights, when the blizzards came screaming down out of the mountains the way they always would, the two of them sat close by the same fire that had thawed her back to life. And whenever a stranger's knock came out of the storm, they rose together and opened the door, every single time, because they had both learned what a shut door costs, and neither would ever pay that price again. There were nights, of course, when the old fear crept back to the edge of her, when a knock came late or a shape moved wrong against the snow and her hand remembered a bolt. Gideon never scolded her for it. He would only take that remembering hand in his and walk with her to the door himself and open it, so that she learned the new habit against his steadiness until it became her own. She did the same for him in her own way, sitting close on the evenings when the wind sounded too much like the winter he had crawled through, saying nothing, just being a warmth that had chosen to stay. The two of them mended slower and truer than any wound binds. One small kept promise at a time. Perhaps neither of them could have healed alone. It took her failure to become his rescue, and his mercy to become her forgiveness. Each one the exact key the other's lock had been waiting for. Emily Dickinson said it plainer than any story could. Hope is the thing with feathers that perches in the soul, and sings the tune without the words, and never stops at all. Emily Dickinson. Nora Kessler had bolted hope out in the cold for 2 long winters, and Gideon Marsh had buried it under a scar, and between them they dug it back up and gave it a warm place to sing. So here is the question to sit with tonight. When the storm is loudest and the easy thing is to slide the bolt, which door in your own life are you still afraid to open? Tell us in the comments below, because a story like Nora and Gideon's lives or dies on whether we are brave enough to answer that knock. If this one warmed you, stay close by the fire. I promise the next one is waiting for you right now.